Back better than ever. It's the Sixers Talk podcast presented to you by Wilmington University. WilmU Works. I'm Ben Berry, one of your normal hosts. Also joined by the one, the only Noah Levick from NBC Sports Philadelphia. Noah, how you doing today?
Hey, Ben, I'm doing all right. Free agency. First night is always chaotic and fun. So good that we're into the thick of it and have some interesting material for this podcast for sure.
We got some good stuff, some signings, some guys staying, some guys leaving. No, before I get into the serious stuff, question. It's a loaded one. Who do you enjoy doing the pod more with, me or Danny?
I mean, that's an impossible one to answer. No, you both bring different qualities to the table. Both have good versatility. Able to talk about anything. So no, you're not going to get me to answer that one.
I'm shocked you even thought about it. I thought you would have been like, "I'm sorry, my audio went out," but
that would have been the way to go, probably. Yeah,
it would have. So we have several things happening. Dwight Howard agreed to go back to the Lakers. We'll get into that. We have reports that George Hill will likely be waived by the Sixers. But let's start off with everyone's favorite Sixer to hate, then love, then hate again, just jumping all over the place. Furkan Korkmaz agreeing to a 3-year, $15 million deal to stay here in Philly. What were your immediate thoughts when you heard that news break?
For me, 3 years, 15 million seems like a good, appropriate price for both sides. I think it's unlikely that the Sixers look back in a year or two and really strongly regret giving him that contract. He's 24 years old. Over the last two seasons, he's 39% from three-point range. He's especially valuable for this team, which was bottom 5 in three-point frequency, in that he is never shy about shooting the ball. And we've seen in the past, he has these games that come out of nowhere where he single-handedly wins it for you. He just gets extremely hot off the bench. And I think those type of players certainly are worth some money. So 3 years, 15 million, yeah, seems pretty smart for both sides. I guess he'll be 27 when that contract ends. So he'll be here, the Sixers hope, for the early stages of his prime. I think the team has felt confident that he's a growing, developing player. They like the progress he's made defensively. Personally, I still have some skepticism that he's someone who will ever be super reliable defensively, but I do give him credit for improving his effort on that end of the floor, being better about just giving attention to detail on defense. And I think three-point shooting, look, it's something that everyone is searching for in today's NBA. So for the Sixers to add a young three-point shooter that is well-liked for 3 years, 15 million, seems like a solid move to me on paper.
Yeah, it seems like a great move on paper. I just have to explain my whole Furkan experience when I moved back to the area in fall 2019. It seemed like people were crazy about him, and he stuck around Brett Brown's last year. And I remember going into the season talking to Danny and Paul that used to be with us, Paul Hudrick. It was no one seemed to be high on him, especially talking to those two. The night of my brother's wedding was the night he went off. And I remember the episode of the podcast from that day was like eating some Furkan or something like that. And that was my introduction to the Furkan Korkmaz experience. Just, I want to say the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, but it was just ups and downs where 1 minute people loved him, and the next minute people didn't, as I alluded to in the beginning of the pod. And it's just, I would say that just speaks to consistency. He's definitely a tricky shooter. I think he's gotten better on the defense, and I think that might be to him playing with a bunch of starters compared to reserves. There's still at times I would like to see more from him on that end of the floor. But all things considering, 3 years for 15, $5 million each, that's definitely a steal. Was it Fit Pro Fit projected him at his value at 8.1 million last year, and this year was going to be projected at 9 million. So to get a player at projected to make 9 million a year for only 5 million, when shooting's a premium in this league, and it's something the Sixers have needed for the last several years, it's more than a steal. It's not mind blowing. It's just a great deal. It's something that will help him beat out, because if he doesn't have shooters around him, other teams just collapse in on him. So I'm very happy with the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also worth noting, in addition to just the good value on the surface, the Sixers had his bird rights. So this is not a situation where they had to like eat into their mid-level exception. You know, they could sign him without being worried about salary cap restrictions, or using one of those tools that could potentially be useful down the line. So that's another small bonus there. Yeah, I think, frankly, I've always kind of taken it with a grain of salt when we've heard over and over again from the Sixers that Korkmaz was improving defensively, and that Brett Brown called him a bomber off the bench, and just the general notion that they see this really high ceiling for him. But I think he deserves a lot of credit for coming from a place where it seemed like he might not stick in the NBA. You know, the Sixers declined his third-year option, and it seemed his time with the team here was likely done. Then he returns and earns minutes and gets, in much better physical shape, and commits himself to defense. And so give him a ton of credit just for the development he's made already. And I think it is not unrealistic to think that he still has some room to grow. So absolutely a strong deal for the Sixers to start free agency. I think that's a hard one to argue with.
So one of the things that we talked about, whether it's you and me or you and Danny or me and Danny coming into the offseason, was the 3 free agents. We'll get it to Dwight Howard a little later. But someone that Furkan filled this player's position when he got injured, Danny Green. So Danny Green brought tremendous value to the Sixers last year. Veteran, championship voice in the locker room. You saw what happened on the defensive end when he was out in that 7-game series with the Hawks. I'm not saying the Sixers lost because Danny Green didn't play, but his presence was missed. What does bringing Furkan back on his 3-year deal, do you think that implies anything for Danny Green's future here in Philadelphia?
It's tough to read right now. Obviously, free agency is a very fluid situation. It's possible something breaks as we're recording this podcast. We'll touch on it a little later, but the reported news that the Sixers are planning to waive George Hill, I think, means that a Danny Green return is very much on the table. So no, I don't think it completely prohibits, Danny Green from returning. I think it's also notable that the Miami Heat, a possible destination for Green, were the most active team early in free agency, adding Kyle Lowry, re-signing Duncan Robinson, a shooter, for a lot of money, adding PJ Tucker, re-signing Dwayne Dedmon. So the Heat just don't have the room to add a player of Danny Green's caliber, which at least takes one potential team off the market, you would think. But that Danny Green situation, at least at the time we're recording this, is one of the major looming questions with the Sixers in free agency, outside of course, what's going to happen with Ben Simmons. But out of the Sixers free agents, I think he potentially is a big domino. If he returns to Philadelphia, that in all likelihood means the Sixers have the taxpayer mid-level exception. If they let him walk, it would appear the Sixers might be using the full mid-level exception. So his return, not just for all the reasons you stated about his on-court value, but also just how it fits in with all these other free agency related pieces is really important. So that's going to be intriguing to see how that plays out. My read on it right now, though, to kind of more directly answer your question, is everything is on the table, and a lot of it's just in Danny Green's court of what he wants to do and what his preferences are here.
Hey, what you just said wrapped up exactly how I felt about it. At how things currently stand, if Danny Green wants to be back in Philadelphia, I think he'll be back. With how the salary cap is set up, I see the only way him leaving is if someone he just wants to be somewhere else, whether money involved or not. How the money is set up, whether Miami's practically off the table now, but if it was, I'm just throwing teams out there, the Lakers or the Rockets or whatever. If he left, in my opinion, it's just because he doesn't want to be here anymore. That's how I read just how the Sixers salary cap situation is, the rights and the relationships to him, and even this Furkan move. So,
yeah, I mean, and again, the Sixers have Danny Green's early bird rights, which means they can pay him up to 175% of his salary last season. So again, they can offer him whatever he needs from a financial perspective. I guess always with Daryl Morey, you wonder if he's got something up his sleeve and whether the plan to waive George Hill is part of some larger scheme that involves, maybe Danny Green not being here. But no, for the most part, I agree with you that if you read the tea leaves, Danny Green coming back is something that none of us would be surprised by, and we're all just waiting to see exactly how that plays out.
So that is two Sixers free agents, players that was up for free agency. After this short commercial break, we'll come back with the third, Dwight Howard, and his next move.
Start college, build skills, and complete your degree with Wilmington University. 100% online options and affordable tuition makes WilMU work for you. Learn more at wilmu.edu.
What's up, Sixers fans? Moving on, Dwight Howard has agreed to terms to go back to La La Land, as he calls it in the movie. He's going back to the Los Angeles Lakers. It was last year where the report was he agreed to terms. Then less than 2 hours later, he was a Sixer. So who knows what to make of all that still. I think the explanation I heard was still somewhat comical to me, but the Sixers need a backup center now. Dwight Howard, I think he had a ridiculous rebound rate last year, but unfortunately for him, he just was not a good fit if Ben Simmons was on the court. And when Ben Simmons wasn't on the court with them, it was too much hit or miss. So this might be just a natural upgrade for the Sixers. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, the numbers were staggeringly poor. I mean, I think if you just watched the games and you saw Simmons and Howard together, you recognized it wasn't a great fit. But in both the regular season and the postseason, the Sixers were outscored by double digits per 100 possessions when those guys shared the floor. So I think it's unsurprising that Dwight Howard is moving on or moving back to Los Angeles for a third time. It's going to be really interesting to see how the Sixers go about changing things up at that backup center spot. Daryl Morey, I think, made an intriguing comment on draft night, just in regard to the 2 second-round big men they drafted, but that the Sixers want big men who are switchable and can shoot, and Dwight Howard is neither of those things. So you figure in replacing Dwight Howard or adding multiple guys to replace him, or however they go about this, a little more versatility will be a priority in how they approach this. And I think that's fair enough. But quite a few notable names are off the market. Kelly Olynyk, a guy we talked about, got paid quite well by the Pistons, so he was out of the Sixers price range. Gorgie Jang is off the table. Dwayne Dedman is off the table. So Still some folks out there, but quite a few off the table that might have been possibilities for the Sixers. But a lot of action happens early in free agency, but not everything. And especially when you're talking about veteran minimum sort of players, a lot of those signings happen days down the line. So I don't think there's any need to panic that the Sixers didn't immediately come up with a Dwight Howard replacement, but will be important that they find a decent solution behind Joel Embiid.
I completely agree. Need someone to fill in those minutes when Embiid gets some rest or the inevitable injury. I'm gonna throw some names at you. You tell me what you think. And also, I know you wrote down some names too. You can throw those at me as well. Let's start off with DeMarcus Cousins.
Yeah, I wouldn't be super enthused about that. I don't think, especially for a minimum deal, it would be a bad move. I think it would probably be a somewhat similar situation to Dwight Howard, where I don't think you'd feel very comfortable if that's your only backup center, just given the defensive limitations. But if he's one backup center and there's another guy who could maybe check more of those boxes of being switchable defensively, then, I think it would be an okay move. It wouldn't be something that I personally would be incredibly excited about, because DeMarcus Cousins is not the player he once was, but he is willing to shoot threes. He could provide a little jolt at times offensively. He was capable of playing in the postseason with the Clippers. So all those are positives, that would support the idea of him for a minimum deal, not being a bad move, perhaps.
I used to be a big DeMarcus Cousins fan. It's unfortunate the injuries in his career. I actually wanted the Sixers to draft him when he was coming out. That didn't happen. So I would have to agree with you. Definitely on the defensive end, it's just it wouldn't work. He wasn't wildly athletic and agile before the injuries, and since then is really taking a toll on the defensive end of the ball for him on the side of the floor. His offense, he can step out, he can shoot the three, he can add the spark, but if the Sixers signed him, they would definitely need another center to anchor the defense end and be able to be switchable. Hassan Whiteside.
That would be most likely a no for me. I think everyone knows he's a guy who is extraordinarily gifted at blocking shots, but that there are a lot of other flaws in his game. So that's not someone that I see a great argument for the Sixers pursuing, to be quite frank. I think it would be fascinating with Joel Embiid because there's the beef history there. And it would be really, really interesting to see how they would deal with that past animosity. But just in terms of the on-court fit, I mean, he's better than some NBA centers out there, and he has an elite skill in terms of his shot blocking, but I just think the overall player, in all likelihood, would not be a great addition for the Sixers.
He was added to this list just because of the chaos that would ensue if he was signed here. And I'm a big fan of chaos, but man, it's wild to think about, because at one point he was never the best center in the league, but he was definitely, like, you could put him in the top 10, I would say, and just how fast it all kind of fell apart when he fell out of favor in Miami, and people thought he would get a second chance in Portland. Well, he got the second chance. It just hasn't worked out there or since. He, on the defensive end, like, he could do some things, but between him being like, as some former teammates and coaches have described him as a knucklehead, and the animosity between him and Joel Embiid just would not work out. My favorite on this list, Paul Millsap.
Yeah, I think he is not someone you could count on to be a backup center. He's only 6'8", and for the most part plays power forward, but as a power forward, absolutely can even at 36 years old, provide scoring, provide three-point shooting, and the depth behind Embiid is important, but also behind Tobias Harris, the Sixers were sorely lacking there. And that was a glaring weakness in the playoffs to the extent that George Hill was guarding Danilo Gallinari in a game 7. So Paul Millsap would fill a void for the Sixers, and even at 36 is still a decent NBA player. You figure the price for him would be some sort of mid-level deal, whether it's, I don't know, all of the taxpayer mid-level or a chunk of it. And you figure that would probably be pretty appropriate for a player of his caliber. So I'm with you in thinking he would be, perhaps a good addition for the Sixers.
Yeah, if the Sixers signed him, they would definitely need another center for size because you can't. I wouldn't expect him to play the backup 5 and 4 all 82 games. He would definitely add that depth at forward as well, his natural position. He can step out. I think he can switch on the defensive end, and what you just said about George Hill playing Gallinari. So that out of the list I came up with, that's who popped in my head or who jumped off the list the most to me. We have former Sixer Tony Bradley up next.
I'd strongly endorse that one for sure. Was a bit curious to see Oklahoma City, not see him as a piece of that team's future. I thought he might fit quite nicely there as part of a young core, but evidently the Thunder did not feel that way. But outside of the fact that he wasn't a super willing three-point shooter, although he did talk before the season about his hopes to become one, I think he was very good in Philadelphia and came into his own after some initial growing pains with learning the Sixers offense and becoming comfortable in this setting, and worked extremely hard to lose a lot of weight and get himself in the best shape of his career. And I think we saw that pay dividends. And look, he's not an incredibly agile defender, but he's a decent drop big man who can move his feet and position himself well. And he's good at knowing his role and performing it well. So I think there's a good case for him returning to Philadelphia. No question about that. Yeah.
If Sixers went the young route, that's definitely the way I feel they should go. They want the young backup center. Robin Lopez.
Yeah, he's a fine backup center and has been for quite a while. It was fun this season to see his unorthodox, very unique kind of half hook shot became a real weapon, and he was converting it at this highly efficient rate. So good on him for developing that shot and becoming so excellent at it at 32, 33 years old. Again, I think with Lopez, it's a situation where you'd want more than one backup center. We saw in Washington, they had a trio, none of whom were able to stop Joel Embiid, but Lopez is not capable of being the sole backup center on a good team at this stage in his career, but he's been a productive NBA player for a long time. No doubt he's someone who could chip in a few positive minutes in a playoff series, and he's known for being a well-liked guy in all the locker rooms he's been in. So for him, if he theoretically would be on a minimum deal, I think that would make sense for the Sixers and for a lot of teams around the league. He's someone that could probably fit in pretty well wherever he ends up.
I definitely agree with that. Last one, Frank Kaminsky.
I wouldn't be a huge fan of that move. I know he actually played all right in the final game of the finals, although Phoenix lost. But up until that point, I think had been largely disappointing following Dario Saric's injury. I think they were likely hoping Kaminsky would provide them a little bit more. again, as it feels like a broken record, but the number one asset there would just be that he is willing to shoot threes and makes threes. I think besides that, there's not a whole lot there's not a whole lot working in his favor. He was good enough to play on an NBA Finals team, but that was a Finals team that didn't have much depth at center. He was there because of an injury to Saric. So Kaminsky, I would understand if the Sixers were to add him, again, because of Daryl Morey's quest for shooting and just adding NBA quality players in the front court, even if they're not great NBA quality players. But Kaminsky, personally, I wouldn't be a huge fan of that addition.
This is all I need to say about Frank Kaminsky, and this isn't me trying to be a hater or anything. I forgot he was in the league until the finals started, and that's just being completely honest. I was like, oh, that's where Frank Kaminsky ended up. So I know you had some names from you want to shout those out.
Yeah, I had two more. Yeah, I think with Kaminsky and all these guys too, I mean, I say that just me personally, as someone who watches the league and tries to assess what might work for the Sixers, that I wouldn't be a huge fan of Kaminsky. But all these guys, a minimum signing it's the lowest risk thing out there. There's zero risk. Teams can fill their roster with them. The Miami Heat will probably have 5 or 6 minimum guys. So it's one of those things where, few of these moves are bad moves if they're for the minimum. But yeah, for me, I had Luke Cornett and Kem Birch. Cornett would be in that minimum category. Good passer. He's a shot blocker. He's willing to take threes. I think, for the minimum, someone who would make sense for the Sixers, in those regards. And then Kem Birch, I think, is a super solid player, one of the league's better offensive rebounders, but unlike Dwight Howard, he doesn't bring some of the same sort of issues to the table in terms of fouling and turning the ball over a bunch. And I think Kem Birch, as a mid-level sort of target, would be a reasonable one for the Sixers for those reasons. Mostly a backup with the Magic, and then post-deadline went to the Raptors and was pretty impressive in that 19-game stint there. So those were two other names that came to mind for me. But at some point soon, I'm sure we'll get a little bit of clarity about exactly what path the Sixers go down here.
Out of those names you gave me, I will probably lean Birch. But fans, tell us who you want in the comments, whether it's Kaminsky, Birch, Millsap, Bradley. Comment, especially if you're watching on YouTube. We're going to go hit a quick commercial break. We'll come back, talk about the guy the Sixers got last year in the trade, George Hill.
Start college, build skills, and complete your degree with Wilmington University. 100% online options and affordable tuition makes WilmU work for you. Learn more at wilmu.edu.
The one and only Noah Levick joining me today on the Sixers Talk podcast. Last segment of the day, George Hill came out last night. Reports are that the Sixers do not plan on bringing George Hill back. He was he was a disappointment last season once he got here in Philadelphia, whether it was offensive game not coming together or just things not meshing well. So it makes you wonder, what do they do with the backup point guard position? But let's first start off. How do you feel about George Hill leaving Philadelphia?
I was a little bit surprised. I thought even if the team didn't have a ton of faith in his ability to provide a little bit more offensively, just having him under contract for $10 million heading into the trade deadline potentially could have been useful. And I think the chances of him having somewhat of a bounce back year as a shooter and offensive player are not low, just given that he was dealing with this mallet thumb injury that seemed to really be a nagging one and disrupt his rhythm and comfort level, especially as he transitioned to a new team. So I think that element of it struck me as a little bit unexpected. I think, like we alluded to earlier, it's going to be really interesting to see where this fits in the bigger picture. One of the elements of that is, does Danny Green come back here? Okay, if Danny Green doesn't come back here, are the Sixers going to be a non-tax-paying team who uses the full mid-level exception? Okay, if they're not going to do that, what do they plan to do heading into the season? So there are a ton of questions kind of related to this, report that they're waiving George Hill. But I think one of them that's intriguing is whether Tyrese Maxey steps into a bigger role. I mean, as you alluded to, Hill was, a regular member of the rotation in the playoffs, and just one of the natural byproducts of that is Tyrese Maxey's minutes were a little more sporadic for much of the postseason. Daryl Morey on draft night was pretty transparent about the fact that they have Maxey and believe in him so much means that maybe his position is a lesser need this offseason. So I wouldn't be stunned if there's not a corresponding George Hill move, where they're picking up a player who provides the exact same skill set. But it's definitely a bit curious to me, because even if you didn't trust that George Hill would, return to form offensively, there were some benefits to bringing him back, and I don't think there were many apparent downsides to doing so. So it's one of those where I think we will be able to assess it much better once some of these other important decisions play out.
That's very well put. It caught me off guard. He did play okay at best at times last year. Once he got here to Philadelphia, yeah, my big takeaway was, like, I guess they're trusting Maxey with more minutes, especially how sporadic his minutes were in the postseason. And he had big games in the regular season. He had some very big moments in the postseason. So, and Doc isn't crazy about playing rookies. Maxey isn't a rookie anymore. So my takeaway was we'll see more Maxey. Everything with the money stuff, as you pointed out, and this said, that's why it might be the most just not confusing, just like, what are they doing next type move, which I'm interested to see play out. But I guess seeing more Maxey, which is how it looks, isn't the worst thing. I'm actually a fan of it.
Yeah, I think we've seen with Daryl Morey in this front office that flexibility and optionality, they're big buzzwords, but they are principles that they try their best to adhere to, and they want to maximize flexibility. So it's possible that part of this is just that overriding principle of, okay, if we don't have that $10 million committed for next season, Hill was only guaranteed $1.3 million, that just opens up more potential avenues for us. But you also wonder whether there are specific avenues that they have in mind. And I think it's just a little bit too early to tell. Personally, I've always liked George Hill's game. I think he's solid defensively. He's someone you can trust in the playoffs. He makes 3-point shots. He doesn't turn the ball over much. But they just needed a little bit more from him offensively. Like in that Hawks series, he averaged 2.4 points per game, shot 30% from the floor, 22% from 3-point range. Like that, there's no way to frame that other than, as you said, as disappointing. And maybe you chalk it up as just a bad series, but he is 35 years old, and I think you can also argue reasonably enough that maybe he is on the downturn a little bit with his career. So we'll see if it's a move they regret, but I think, again, it's part of this bigger picture of their offseason. And as far as we can tell, unlike a team like the Miami Heat that was super aggressive early in free agency, the Sixers are in the early stages of their offseason, and there's a lot of moves that they still could potentially make.
Very well put, Noah. Before we get out of here, what are you working on over at the site at NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com?
Really, bottom line is just staying up to date with the latest on free agency. We had stories on all the moves yesterday. We'll plan to continue having that moving forward, and anything super significant, we'll weigh in with some analysis and opinion on whatever the Sixers do here.
Oh, nice. You know what I'm going to work on? I just hit this whole pot without turning my ring light on. I'm an idiot. I am a complete idiot. And I know a bunch of you guys listening already thought that. But yeah, just hit the whole pot without my ring light on. So for Noah Levick, the smarter one out of us two, or three if you include Danny, who's on vacation, I'm Ben Berry. This was the Sixer Talk podcast presented to you by Wilmington University. William U. Works. We'll catch you next time.